The subject matter is transcendent events. And my name is Bob Hesse, and I've got a doctorate in physical chemistry, co-founded a group called Contemplative Network, where we teach a form of theistic meditation, interfaith. We do medical research, and then based on the medical research, we establish ministries to help healing of people. And I'll get into that. But today's discussion is on transcendent events, and and I'm teaching a graduate course right now on the subject of faith and science. So I try to grab my slides out of that, basically. Um, so transcendent events is healing research on interfaith contemplative prayer is really the subject. And you'll have a chance to perhaps see the how to get a hold of me by email, webpage, and YouTube on presentations from the recording. I just published a book on faith and science, and it's a journey into God's mystical love. It was published May 1st, and it's an unusual genre. It's a mixture of both my memoir, which is my own personal journey back to my own faith through science, and it's also a textbook for a graduate course on faith and science. So it's meant to be interfaith. So the way I try to present this is to give the science and then encourage people to interpret that and incorporate it in whatever faith they feel they're comfortable with. But there's no question there's a asymptotic convergence of faith and science right now. Basically, the book chapters to mix that genre are personal in the beginning. But then there are basically 4 chapters here that I'm going to be jumping through quickly. Physics to creation. And I'm not going to talk about every subject, obviously, because it's in the book. Chemistry to life, biology to consciousness, and psychology to mysticism. And then I ended with a personal note, but I'm not going to be getting into that. It's going to be mainly the 4 technical chapters. And I like to put quotes up to kind of tie this as to where this is at. Both religion and science require a belief in God. For believers, God is the beginning, and for physicists, he is at the end of all considerations. To the former, he is the foundation, to the latter, the crown of the edifice of every generalized worldview. Sounds like a religious person, right? Actually, Max Planck, Nobel Prize winner for quantum theory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give some quotes on science and faith from different people to kind of get a sense of this common attitude that we have, because in my belief system, God dwells within everyone on earth. And so that's what makes my attitude very interfaith. We talk about miracles quite often. Well, miracles are not contrary to nature, but only contrary to what we know about nature, which is a lot of times is not the definition of miracles for people, because a lot of times people think it's an exception to the laws of nature. There are only 2 ways to live your life: as though nothing is a miracle, or as though everything is a miracle. And again, I'm tying faith and science together. We don't expect that. So the first is physics to creation, and I'll get into that. This was not in my book because this came about after the publication of my book. I had given an image of the galaxies in the universe based on the Hubble Deep Space Probe, but then the Webb Deep Field just came out a few months ago. And this is the view of the heavens if you held a grain of sand at arm's length and you looked behind that grain of sand, you would see these dots, and each one of these is a galaxy. So the first thing I want to do is kind of deal with the beginning of this whole deal, okay? So the visible universe, we're estimating 200 to 700 plus billion stars per galaxy, 100 to 170 plus billion galaxies. We don't know for sure. Around 20 to 1,190 plus billion trillion stars. We can't even get our head around this. And so it brings to mind, in my belief system, how precious to me are your designs, oh God, how vast the sum of them. Where do I count them? They would outnumber the sands. Well, sure as anything they do. I mean, it's incredibly big. So the sands thing kind of captured me. And those of you who know, and I don't want to speak down, I don't want to insult the scientists present, but I will talk about numbers. And as you know, the powers of a 10 can make a number gigantic. But there are an estimated 7 times 10 to the 20 sand grains on Earth, and there are an estimated 7 times 10 to the 27 atoms in each human. So we share in this magnitude mentality that we got to start to think about. So the total universe that I just described to you is only 4% of the universe. It's the visible portion. There's another 23% dark matter and 73% dark energy. So we see very little of the universe. We know this other stuff exists because of the effects that the visible has on the invisible. We can see where it's at. So Einstein comes up with a unified theory. He wants to combine the forces of gravity and the forces of electromagnetic energies and those equations. And those were the only two forces he was aware of when he came up with the idea that the universe has got to be one. There's oneness to the universe. There's common design. That's the whole assumption of scientists, is that the universe is one. And so he came up with a unified theory equation, and it was only based on these two forces. Of course, later, strong and weak nuclear forces came about, and that's what led to string theory, membrane theory, and not to have the scientist outdone with a sense of humor, P-brain theory. So, you know, I don't know how many dimensions, but the equations that seem to apply the best are those dimensions that are 11 plus dimensions. So we only see a full fraction of these in our dimensional level. The four dimensions: length, width, depth, and time. I did this just to get my head around the magnitudes. I arbitrarily set the magnitude of weak nuclear at 1, and that made these others these magnitudes. And what's rather interesting is, even though gravity is incredibly small compared to the other forces, it was the first one to be discovered. Now, having said that, Einstein comes up with an equation for the unified theory, and it predicts a beginning to the universe. So he got uncomfortable with that and put a fudge factor in the equation. And Father Lemaitre, father of the Big Bang Theory, removed Einstein's fudge factor in a meeting with Einstein, encouraged him that his equation was actually correct. And so, having said that, Einstein reverted back to his original equation, which was correct, and it showed a beginning to the universe. Now, what are the attributes of that beginning, or what is called a singularity? Well, the attributes are: it's dimensionless. It has no material. It's timeless. There's no light. So it's not constrained by space and time. It's ordered perfectly. It is at zero entropy, which is a measure of disorder in the universe. And it's unified, 4 forces. So these were the attributes of the singularity that Einstein basically came up with as a result of his equation. Now, having said that, what's interesting is, and some of you, I'm sure, have heard of this, you've all heard of it, but the anthropic principle became apparent, and that is the 4 forces of nature were so extremely fine-tuned at the Big Bang that the likelihood of the emergence of a single cell in the universe is like a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and assembling a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. Now, this was a verbal way of describing, and it was described by Father Spitzer, who happens to be the person who did the foreword to my book, former president of Gonzaga University. But lest you think this is a stretch to be quoting a religious person, the math behind this is mind-numbing. The probability that he's describing in numbers is 10 to the 10th to the 123rd. You can't even wrap your head around that number. It's incredible. So Now let's store that piece of information on the attributes of the singularity. Let's store that. And let's talk about chemistry to life, okay? This is an artist rendering of the DNA molecule. Every atom in our bodies was once from a star. Its origins came from the star. And I occasionally have to quote myself because I want to put the thing up there, but whatever can I say? Then what was interesting is in the late 1800s, it was the God is dead period. It was God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. Now, this was Nietzsche. Now, what's rather interesting is his idea was that if you can't measure something, it doesn't exist. And that was the principle behind his statement here. And that statement of if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist is in the realm of logic, it comes to deduction rather than induction. Well, then came along the uncertainty principle. The more precisely an electron position is determined, the less precisely the momentum is known, and vice versa. That was Werner Heisenberg. And basically, that was based on induction. In other words, you don't get an absolute answer, you get probabilities. Now, you may say, well, who cares whether you can find the electron's location and momentum at the same time? Well, philosophically, it's critical because basically it says that we cannot know nature completely. So scientists themselves were starting to realize they cannot know nature completely. And this put to rest Nietzsche's concept, because now we're switching from deduction to induction. Deduction gives absolute answers. Induction gives just probabilities. So chaos theory comes along. Chaos theory was started by scientists that were studying weather prediction using the latest computers. And that was done as one of the first things to be done when these computers came online, because they had a tremendous economic impact on food production. And so it became clear that when they would put their cards in to the computer, it was about the same computer that I was using when I was in graduate school, an IBM 1600, which is your iPhone is hundreds of times, thousands of times more powerful than that computer was. So you would put your cards in the next morning, you pull them out, and as any good scientist, they came out and these guys looked at it and they said, well, this doesn't make any sense. The answer makes no sense. And they started to examine everything they could think of. And they thought, well, maybe their input's off. And so they changed the input a little bit. And what they discovered that is chaos is not chaotic. That basically, they call it the butterfly effect. If a butterfly flashes its wings in Beijing, it can change the weather in New York. And so they discovered a fundamental aspect of nature, that is chaos theory. And when you try to graph chaos theory, you would think, well, it's so random that you can't figure it out. Well, it's not chaotic. What it is there's so many variables that we are unable to predict it. So not only was uncertainty principle pushing our limits to understanding, in fact, basically saying we cannot know nature completely, but now chaos theory was doing the same thing. And yet we knew there was a pattern behind it, because when you graph the math, and Edward Lorenz was the one that came up with chaos theory, if you graph the math that the computers are spitting out, you get Mandelbrot fractals. And this is ordered. And if you take a piece of a section, you bore down, it keeps repeating itself. So the result is that chaos is not chaotic. It's just that we can't predict. It's too complicated. Our actions, then, chaos theory confirms, our smallest act of love or sin will have a dramatic effect in the world beyond what we can know. And so it's true. So it's that's why it's so important to be kind and loving to everybody, because we can't predict the outcome. You get to DNA complexity. The world of molecules evidently has an inherent tendency to be moved toward emergent complexity, life, and consciousness. The meaning of the message conveyed by DNA is not given by the laws of chemistry. As Ian Barber, physicist. And then you realize the share of DNA amongst the animal kingdom, other humans, chimpanzees, cats, etc. I want to tell you, I was very hurt when I discovered cats had a closer relationship than dogs. I like dogs, but this shattered my image. And so cows, mice, fruit flies, common DNA amongst the animal kingdom. It begged the question for me, if chimpanzees have 97% of the same DNA we do, why didn't they build skyscrapers? Why didn't they land on the moon? Which leads to biology to consciousness. The logical next step. Consciousness to matter. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. Who could that be? Max Planck, again. The scientists are starting to look at this. Consciousness in universe. Consciousness seems to me to be such an important phenomenon that I simply cannot believe that it is something just accidentally conjured up by a complicated computation. It is the phenomenon whereby the universe's very existence is made known. One can argue that a universe governed by laws that do not allow consciousness is no universe at all. Wow. You read this to a non-scientist or a person that's just religious, they can't get their head around it. Even scientists can't get their head around it. This is Roger Penrose, Oxford physicist, when he was much younger. Now, Joshua, you remember he was in Switzerland giving a presentation.
Yeah.
And he's kind of my hero. I like him. I read his first book when I was like 17. He's in his 80s now. And it was on The Emperor's New Mind, why computers can never duplicate mind thinking and reasoning. And he's the one that gave the math to Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking didn't have the math necessary to do what he did, and he got it from Penrose. There are brain dualities. There are separate hemispheres. There are present and future, multi-stable perception, and conscious and unconscious. I won't go into the other three, but I do want to focus on conscious and unconscious. The unconscious unknown. The unconscious is just as unknown to us as the reality of the external world, and it is just as imperfectly reported to us through the data of consciousness as is the external world through the indications of our sensory organs. Wow. Sigmund Freud. Interesting. Non-physical consciousness. The brain itself doesn't produce consciousness. Oh, really? Wow. That is instead a kind of reducing valve or filter sifting the larger non-physical consciousness that we possess in the non-physical worlds down into a more limited capacity for the duration of our mortal lives. Interesting. This is a man who was a neurosurgeon, and he had a near-death experience, and he believed that before the near-death experience, he believed that all consciousness is in the brain because he was trained as a neurosurgeon. When he got done with that near-death experience, then he realized that his brain was merely a check valve, if you will, for the bigger, broader, I call universal consciousness. So where is all this stuff leading? Consciousness evolution. There's almost a sensual longing for communion with others who have a large vision, the immense fulfillment of friendship between those engaged in furthering the evolution of consciousness as a quality impossible to describe. Does that describe the embassy? I think it does. Does that describe us here? In spite of what our backgrounds may be. Teilhard de Chardin, brilliant scientist, paleontologist, Catholic priest, believe it or not. Health, religion, and health. Now, I think you may or may not be aware of this, but what's interesting about science is there are two realms of scientific study. One is summarized best in this book called Handbook of Religion and Health. And this man collected all of the research projects that he could find on various subjects. And basically, they fell into three categories, and he documented them in this very big volume. One was faith belief. In other words, this was a theistic faith belief. And it showed many different studies, medical studies, of a better, more well-being in people that have a faith belief based on how frequently they attend, they believe, how they attend religious services, but they believe. Now, you may say, well, this doesn't deal with spirituality. Well, that's true, because you can't quantify spirituality. All you can do is quantify religious stuff, because you can say, well, how often you go to a church attendance. And this showed that up to 7 years longer people live, can live based on frequent church attendance. Prayer practice, if you pray regularly, it can lessen depression in this particular study, and I was involved in that. So his book summarized multiple projects, and he said out of 500 studies, 350 said this. So he wasn't doing the studies himself, but he was accumulating them. Now, this is irrespective of the faith belief. Okay, it wasn't geared to particular faith belief. Okay. Now you've got a separate. Anyway, one of the studies that comes out is confirmation bias. This is a tough one. Studies show the human tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information from the unconscious in a way that confirms one's beliefs or hypotheses, while giving disproportionately less attention to information that contradicts it. Now, what that's saying is, they did studies interviewing people ahead of time. They said, well, what religion do you belong to? What political party do you believe in? What race are you of? And it goes through the different generalities that we see all the time in the press. Then they gave a set of research studies that confirmed their belief, or some that confirmed other beliefs, etc. Disproportionately, they select the ones that confirm their existing belief. It's called confirmation bias. It's part of the basic nature of humans. So basically, it's rationalization, automatic, it's unintentional, indeliberate, it's mechanistic, evidentiary, irrational, illusory. So how do we overcome this when we interpret the scientific data? Because we all have this problem. Every human on earth has that problem. That leads to psychology, to mysticism. The most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mystical. Anybody want to predict who said that? Interesting. Oh, interesting. I have come to believe that scientists will quite often have mystical experiences, and that's how they get their scientific ideas. The same is true of some of the famous composers, believe it or not. So I'm going to talk about meditation and contemplation. Now, the reason I segmented these is the problem in this whole field is terminology. I am going to use the etymological definitions of these words. Meditation comes from the Latin meditatio, which means to think. In today's day and age, contemplation is to let go of your thoughts and have focus. Okay, it's a different form of prayer, and I'm going to treat both of these as prayer. Okay, but they can be also treated from a non-theistic point of view. Okay. In today's terminology, the word meditation is being used to mean both of these. I'm going to make an exception to that and say, well, these are different, okay? And I'm going to use the term contemplation to refer to other faiths. And the reason is the word contemplation is much more broad than the words that come from each individual faith. So Christianity calls it mysticism. Judaism, Kabbalah, Islam, Sufism, Buddhism, mindfulness, Hinduism, dhyana. So it's the best term that I can find that's applicable to all faiths is contemplation. And the reason I'm so anal about words is because you can't talk to somebody if you don't talk in the same definitions or you don't understand what they're saying. So this kind of contemplation is basically the mind rejects the whole wealth and abundance of thoughts. The soul then pours out to God wordless prayers. Well, that's an interesting statement. That's pretty much captures uh, the theistic approach to contemplation. This guy, John Cassian, wrote the Conferences in the 4th century. This is the oldest work in Christian antiquity. And he said that. So this is very old in terms of the Christian belief system. It's older in terms of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Kabbalah, okay, Judaism. And the Rule of Benedict is a rule that was put together to guide monks and nuns in convents and monasteries. And this book was used by Saint Benedict to establish that. So that came a lot, that blended right into monasteries and convents. Now, who's going to be a devout Christian? If you're Christian, how are you going to be devout? The devout Christian of the future will either be a mystic, one who has experienced something, or she will cease to be anything at all. Who would have said that? Well, I don't know if you who this guy is, but this is Karl Rahner. This guy taught Pope Benedict. He was the theologian for Pope Benedict. So this is on everybody's radar screen, regardless of faith belief. Now, I wanted to share with you how I practice and how I teach a interfaith form of prayer, and I call it centering prayer, but it's actually another weird word we give to it is oneness prayer, okay? And these are the guidelines, and I'm sure that you are all meditators, you probably know this, but I want to state it anyway because it leads into the science. In this case, you take a sacred symbol, word or an image, and you gently rest in it. And it's a symbol of your desire to be with God if it's a prayer. Then you sit in a comfortable position and have that symbol available. Then as thoughts come, and they will, when aware of them or engaged in where you're engaged with your thoughts, you ever so gently return to that sacred word or image. You're saying, I would rather be with you, God, than even with my own thoughts. Now that's the theistic approach. Obviously, non-theistic it's more of a mantra that is self-generated, but this is the theistic approach. Now, you see where I'm headed. We got two sets of research. We got the one set that says if you have a belief in a God, you heal better. And now, and we know from the most of the research on Tibetan Buddhist monks that if you have a meditative practice, you heal better. My interest in research is to combine those two and get double bang for the buck. And so this particular practice is very similar. It says thoughts in return, but it's different in the sense that you're using that symbol as a desire for you to be with God. Okay. And then as you have a gentle readjustment at the end of 20 minutes. Okay. So that's the practice. Now, let's talk about transcendent consciousness. I'm interested in two, and we've done studies on this, and you came to one of the presentations I did in Switzerland on this, but I want to tell you we went further since then, okay? One is near-death experience. Now, that's been documented, completely documented. I mean, people now, scientists recognize it. And this is basically NDE, and SCE is a term I coined because when we did the research papers, I wanted to have a balancing term, NDE versus SCE, but it's really mystical experiences that are not connected with death. One could argue that they're both contemplative experiences in a broader use of the term, but I'm trying to separate the near death from this, which can be generated through that previous prayer practice. I've seen it. I've taught people, and 5% to 10% will have SCE when I teach it to them, when they're new at it, okay? So what are the attributes? Well, paranormal, out of body, spaceless, a certain sense of ecstasy. Now I'm talking about the 5 or 10%. I'm not talking about 90, 100% of the people are 90 plus. Because most people will have a sense of peace. They'll have things happen, but the whole key to the practice is not to do it to get anything out of it. Okay. Cognitive, timeless. The timeless. It seems like the prayer is shorter than it really was. Effective, sense of peace. Wholeness, sense of perfection. A transcendent, divine, spiritual sense. A oneness of the universe, kind of a sense of oneness to the universe. Okay. So I started to see these things, and I approached a researcher, and he said, well, we can do brain scans on people remembering those two experiences. And I didn't necessarily believe him. I thought that's not solid science because, of course, you can't catch them in it. That's the problem. So he said, no, it's neuroscientists believe that you can do the brain scans on people who are remembering. And the question is, what tool are you going to pick? Well, you want a tool that gives you a spatial definition of where in the brain it's happening, and you want a temporal sense of how long it's lasting, etc. You could choose those tools for spatial. You could choose this for temporal. They're very good. This gives you a bit of both. But he pointed out to me that the best for both is quantitative EEG tomography. And we did the studies, and we discovered that, yes, indeed, the attributes are similar between the two. And we use the Grayson scale, which is very well known for measuring this. So now let's go back to those transcendent events. Dr. Moody described the NDE attributes in 75, and Grayson scale developed the scale for it. Dr. William James described the mystical attributes in the varieties of religious experience in 1902. Let's talk about that singularity. I didn't bring that up for no reason. Einstein's theories led to the attributes of that singularity. Now, why do I think about these as transcendent events? I think of these as the connection, as the transcendence between this world and the next, whether it's from the beginning or SCE or NDE or during your life, okay? So let's take a look at how they're related. And these words are quite often used by these people, okay? That's how I get them. Paranormal, out of body, spaceless ecstasy, dimensionless, non-material, spaceless, cognitive, timeless, timeless, short prayer, timeless, no light. There's no time at the singularity. There's no dimension. Effective peace, wholeness. Take a guess what it is at the singularity. Zero entropy, perfectly ordered. Transcendent, divine, religious, oneness with universe, unified, four forces. This gets back to Einstein's equations. Now, I'm not suggesting that I'm interested personally, and part of it is I would no way I could study this and compare, because this is not within the unconscious brain. But it's rather interesting that these are transcendent events that have similar attributes, as well they should, because it's a transition between this world and the next. And scientists know that consciousness survives death. That's key. So what did I do with this? Well, I was going to all these conferences around the world, and I realized they weren't talking to each other. Drove me crazy. And those two different batches of research I told you about, the one with Harold Koenig and the study on the Tibetan Buddhist monks and meditation regardless of faith, why not bridge them, get these people talking to each other? And since they weren't, we established our own contemplative network interfaith organization called Contemplative Network. And to make it interfaith, we set up a board of people from different faiths. Reverend John Graham is an Episcopal priest. Harvey Rosenstock is a psychiatrist and a Kabbalist. Jewish Kabbalist. Roshi Kennedy is a Zen Buddhist Roshi. We've got an entrepreneur, Lansing Jones, and we've got a professor that teaches at the university here, Carol Petney, and Gina Davis, who's also an Episcopal priest. I'm Catholic, so just to let you know, we're the full board. So having said that, we have been doing research and expanding on different things: Parkinson's, depression, NDE, SCE, because it helps with palliative care to lessen people's fear of death, and PTSD. Now, why are we doing that? Well, when you go to the secular world and you say, okay, we recommend you teach people how to pray in this certain way because of those two research data, okay? And we go to the VA hospital, Veterans Administration, they don't allow religion in there. I can't do it. They will allow Buddhist mindfulness, which is wonderful because it helps people. But to have both, to double bang for your buck on this research, and you combine these two sets of research, we're going to have to do research to show to the secular world that this is healing. Whether they believe in a God or don't, that's not the issue. The issue is if it's healing, let's make it available to the people, because 80% plus of the population believes in a higher power. So it's silly to not take advantage of it. So rather than go into a long explanation of the research results, I want to tell you that I taught it to a patient in Cuba. It was a person in the middle of a Parkinson's freeze. And I had a little bit of an argument with God as how I was going to do this, but I did. That kicked off interest in research, and they started research there, and they recorded 3 patients that they taught that centering prayer practice to during a full-blown freeze. Now, when a Parkinson's patient has a freeze, I don't know if you've seen it, but they contort their eyes. It's terrible to watch. It's horrible, sad. I'm not going to say anything other than to tell you that this is a video. It's about 6 minutes, and then I think I'll hit my time. And this 6 minutes will show you what happened before and after. When I taught it, I had the same reaction. And that is, within 1 or 2 minutes, it stops. The freeze stops. The patient no longer is depressed because the patient is no longer getting sleep deprivation, because they will have these freezes and wake them up in the middle of the night. They start eating again. They want to go out. Having said that, this is in Spanish, but you'll have the English listening to it.
El paciente hace en su rutina diaria, en 2 ocasiones al día, a veces hasta 3, su centro de meditación acompañado por sus familiares. En este caso, no le hicimos el de la mañana para llevarlo a su máximo grado de temblor. Esto le ocasiona un estado de ansiedad generalizada, depresión, angustia, y pues vamos a comenzar en breve a realizar su centro de meditación junto a sus familiares y la doctora neuróloga que lo acompaña. Veremos el cambio de antes y después. Este paciente depende de este método para poder alivianar y quitar tanto temblor que lo abruma. Después de un tiempo de meditación fue logrado. Bueno, queremos hablar contigo porque después de observar el centro de meditación con tu esposa, cómo lograste calmar el temblor hasta el punto de quedar en cero, queremos saber cuántas veces al día realizan este centro de meditación ustedes.
En los días,
Sí,
2 o 3 veces.
de 2 a 3 veces. Y si, ¿qué pasa si tu esposa no te ayuda?
Después, por 20, salgo del sistema.
Te pones muy ansioso
Me pongo muy ansioso,
y muy estresado.
estresado,
Ajá. Y no logras calmarte por ti mismo.
muy poco.
Ya,
Entonces, debo sentirme.
y lo necesitas lo necesitas. ¿Cuántas veces al día ella te ayuda a relajarte?
A veces 2, a veces 3.
A veces tres. Y cuando no te lo hace, ¿qué te pasa? Te estresas, te pones muy mal. Y esa ansiedad lleva a que tiembles más. Y cuando ella te relaja, logras hasta dormirte, quedarte dormido.
No me quedo dormido, pero sí me, me, me mejora, me controla mucho.
Te ayuda a mejorar tu calidad de vida.
Sí.
So, if you want to scan this, you can get the newsletters. I don't know if you're getting them already, but that's from our organization. So I've opened it up to discussion. I'm sorry it took me so long, but whatever.